On my last day, my boss leaned back in his chair and said, "You know what's out there? Nothing. You'll be back in 6 months begging for your desk." I cleaned out my drawer in 4 minutes. Within 90 days, 11 of his top 20 clients had moved their accounts. All to the same place. A firm with one employee. Me. His corner office was empty by December. But let me be honest with you from the start, because this story isn't what you think it is. It's not a revenge story. I didn't leave that office planning to destroy anyone. I left planning to survive. The fact that survival looked like destruction from where he was sitting? That's his problem, not mine. My name is Talia Kendrick, and the company I supposedly couldn't make it without was a boutique environmental consulting firm in Missoula, Montana, called Bridger Environmental Group. 12 employees. Specialized in environmental impact assessments, wetland delineation, and regulatory compliance for mining, timber, and land development projects across the Northern Rockies. The kind of firm that most people have never heard of, but that every developer, every mining company, and every county planning department in western Montana had on speed dial. I need to tell you what environmental consulting actually is, because if you don't understand the work, you won't understand what happened or why it mattered that I was the one doing it. When a company wants to build something, a subdivision, a mine, a ski resort expansion, a highway, a pipeline, they can't just start digging. Federal and state environmental laws require assessments. Someone has to survey the land for wetlands, endangered species habitat, cultural resources, water quality impacts. Someone has to write the reports that get submitted to agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Someone has to stand in a creek in October wearing chest waders and collect macroinvertebrate samples while their fingers go numb, then turn those samples into data, and turn that data into a regulatory document that determines whether a $40 million development project moves forward or dies. That someone for 7 years at Bridger Environmental was me. I grew up in Helena, Montana, the state capital, which sounds more impressive than it is. Helena is a town of about 33,000 people wedged into the eastern slope of the Continental Divide, where the main industries are state government, Carroll College, and an almost religious devotion to fly fishing. My dad was a wildlife biologist for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. My mom taught 4th grade at Central Elementary. We lived in a modest ranch house on Euclid Avenue with a blue heeler named Buckshot and a vegetable garden that produced more zucchini than any family should have to endure. I grew up outside. Not in the Instagram way, not artfully posed in Patagonia gear on mountaintops. In the real way, helping my dad with elk surveys in the Elkhorn Mountains at 5 a.m., sitting in a cold truck with binoculars and a thermos of hot chocolate, learning to identify raptor species by silhouette. Wading through marshes at the Canyon Ferry Wildlife Management Area, cataloging waterfowl for his population studies. I learned to read a landscape the way most kids learn to read books. Not just what was on the surface, but what the surface was telling you about what was underneath. I went to the University of Montana in Missoula, the U if you're from Montana, and God help you if you call it anything else, and studied environmental science with a minor in hydrology. My senior thesis was on benthic macroinvertebrate assemblages as indicators of water quality in tributaries of the Clark Fork River, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds. I spent an entire autumn semester standing knee-deep in freezing creeks, turning over rocks, collecting tiny aquatic insects with a fine mesh net, and cataloging them under a microscope in a basement lab that smelled like formaldehyde and instant coffee. I loved it. Not ironically. Not as a stepping stone to something better. I loved the precision of it. The way a single creek could tell you the health story of an entire watershed if you knew what questions to ask. I loved the feeling of cold water through my waders and the way the light hit the surface of the Clark Fork in late afternoon, turning it into something that looked like hammered silver. After graduation, I got my professional wetland scientist certification through the Society of Wetland Scientists, a credential that requires a specific combination of education, professional experience, and peer review, and that serves as a kind of gold standard in the environmental consulting world. I also completed my Phase 1 environmental site assessment training through the ASTM E1527 standard, which qualifies you to evaluate properties for contamination, the thing banks require before they'll finance any commercial real estate transaction. I was 24 when Bridger Environmental hired me. I was their third employee. The founder and owner was a man named Keith Sattler. I need to tell you about Keith because he's not a cartoon villain, and I'm not going to pretend he was. Keith was 51 when I started, a former Montana DEQ regulator who'd gone private 10 years earlier. He was smart. He was experienced. He had relationships with every agency contact, every county planner, every developer in western Montana. He could walk into a meeting with a skeptical rancher who wanted to build a guest lodge on his property and walk out with a handshake and a $45,000 contract. He had a talent for making complicated regulatory processes feel manageable and for making clients feel like he was on their side rather than just a bureaucratic hurdle they had to clear. He was also a man who believed, with absolute sincerity, that the company was him. That Bridger Environmental existed because of Keith Sattler's relationships, Keith Sattler's reputation, Keith Sattler's name. And for the first few years I worked there, that was largely true. He was the rainmaker. He brought in the clients. The rest of us did the technical work. But here's the thing about environmental consulting, and this is the detail that Keith never fully grasped because it threatened the story he told himself about his own indispensability. The clients come for the relationships. They stay for the work. A developer doesn't care who took them to lunch. They care that the wetland delineation was accurate, that the report satisfied the Army Corps, that the permit came through on time, that the Phase 1 assessment didn't miss anything that would blow up the deal 6 months later. The relationship gets you in the door. The technical competence keeps you in the building. And the technical competence, increasingly, was me. By my third year at Bridger, I was the lead scientist on roughly 60% of the firm's active projects. By my fifth year, it was closer to 75%. I was writing the reports. I was conducting the field surveys. I was the one standing in creeks and crawling through riparian zones and spending 12-hour days in the office turning raw data into documents that could withstand regulatory scrutiny. I was the one the clients called when they had questions. Not Keith's receptionist, not the project manager, me directly, because I was the one who'd actually walked their property and could tell them from memory where the wetland boundary fell relative to their proposed building footprint. I was also, and this part matters, the person training every new hire. When Bridger grew from 3 employees to 12 over my 7 years there, I trained every single field scientist and report writer who came through the door. I wrote the company's internal methodology guides. I developed the template system for our regulatory reports. I built the quality control protocol that ensured every document that left our office met federal and state standards. Keith took credit for all of it. Not maliciously, or, at least, I don't think it was malicious. More reflexively. The way a man takes credit when he genuinely believes that his leadership is the reason things happen, even when he hasn't touched the actual work in years. He'd present reports to clients that I'd written, introduce projects to agency reviewers that I'd managed, and the pronoun was always we in front of clients and I in front of the industry at conferences and marketing materials, in the Bridger environmental bio that listed his credentials but not mine. I tolerated it for a long time. Longer than I should have. Because the work itself was satisfying, and because Montana's environmental consulting world is small, maybe 200 people in the whole state who do what I do, and burning bridges in a world that small can end your career. But here's where I made my mistake. The one I have to own because the rest of this story doesn't make sense without it. In my 5th year at Bridger, Keith offered me a partnership track. Not equity, he was very clear about that. A title bump, a raise, and a vague promise of ownership participation that, when I pressed for details, turned out to mean a 5% profit-sharing arrangement with no voting rights, no equity stake, and a non-compete clause that would have prevented me from doing environmental consulting anywhere in Montana for 3 years if I left. I should have said no. I should have had a lawyer review it. I should have recognized that a 5% profit share with a 3-year non-compete was not a partnership. It was a leash. But I was 30, and I was tired, and I wanted to believe that Keith valued my work enough to share the company with me, and I signed it. That's my flaw. That's the mistake I carry. I was so grateful to be recognized that I signed a document designed to keep me captive. And for 2 years it worked. I stayed. I kept doing 75% of the work for 5% of the profit and the title of Senior Environmental Scientist that looked good on a business card but didn't change my actual authority within the company. Now let me tell you what happened in year 7. Because year 7 is when the ground shifted. Bridger Environmental had grown. We were doing $3.8 million in annual revenue, up from $1.2 million when I started. We had 12 employees. We had major ongoing contracts with 3 mining companies, 2 timber operations, a resort developer in Big Sky, and a dozen smaller clients ranging from ranchers to county governments. Keith had moved into a corner office with a view of the Clark Fork and was spending more and more time on business development, which, as far as I could tell, meant taking potential clients fly fishing on the Bitterroot and expensing 3-hour lunches at the Pearl Cafe downtown. Meanwhile, I was drowning. The workload had doubled, but the technical staff hadn't kept pace. I was managing 8 active projects simultaneously, training 2 new hires who weren't ready for independent fieldwork, and pulling 14-hour days to meet deadlines that Keith had promised clients without consulting me about capacity. I asked for help 3 times, formally in writing. I sent Keith detailed memos because I'm an environmental scientist and documenting things is what we do, outlining the staffing gaps, the deadline risks, and the quality control concerns. I proposed hiring 2 additional senior scientists. I offered to lead the recruitment process. Keith's response, each time, was some variation of, "We'll get there, Talia. The pipeline is strong. Let me work the relationships, and you work the science. Let me work the relationships, and you work the science." 7 years of my career distilled into a division of labor that positioned him as the essential half and me as the replaceable one. The breaking point came in April. A developer called Whitefish Mountain Properties was building a 340-unit residential community on the outskirts of Whitefish, near the base of Big Mountain. The project required a comprehensive environmental impact assessment, wetland delineation, wildlife habitat evaluation, stormwater management plan, cultural resource survey coordination. It was a $220,000 contract, the largest single project in Bridger's history. Keith landed the contract. I'll give him that. His relationship with the developer, a man named Garrett Wilder, went back 15 years. But Keith landed it by promising a 12-week turnaround on the environmental assessment, a timeline that was, to anyone who actually understood the scope of the work, physically impossible without either cutting corners or tripling the field staff. I told him it couldn't be done in 12 weeks. Not to the standard that would satisfy the Army Corps and the Montana DQ. I told him we needed 16 weeks minimum and realistically 20, with additional field support. Keith said, "Garrett needs it in 12. Make it happen." I made it happen, but not in 12 weeks and not without cost. I spent the next 3 months working 6 days a week, often 12 to 16 hours a day. I was in the field 3 days a week, driving up to Whitefish at 5 a.m., spending the day delineating wetlands across 400 acres of terrain that included riparian corridors, seasonal streams, and a section of habitat that showed potential indicators for grizzly bear movement, and then driving back to Missoula at night to work on the report. I lost 11 pounds. I got a stress-related eye twitch that lasted for 2 months. I stopped returning my friends' calls. My apartment on South Higgins looked like a document storage facility. I delivered the assessment in 14 weeks. Not 12, 14. Because I refused to submit a document that wasn't defensible. Keith was furious about the 2-week delay. Garrett Wilder was understanding. He'd worked with enough environmental consultants to know that 12 weeks was always aspirational. But Keith took the delay as a personal embarrassment. He called me into his corner office on a Monday morning. He was leaning back in his chair, that leather executive chair he'd bought for $1,200 from a furniture store in Hamilton, the one that looked ridiculous in a 12-person environmental firm, and he said, "Talia, we need to talk about your performance." My performance. After 14 weeks of working myself into the ground to deliver a $220,000 project that he'd scoped incorrectly. The Whitefish project came in 2 weeks late, he said. Garrett was gracious about it, but that's not the standard I expect. "Keith," I said, "I told you in April that 12 weeks was impossible. I have the email. I sent you a staffing analysis." "I understand your concerns," he said, "and you know, when someone says I understand your concerns, what they actually mean is I heard you and decided you were wrong. But part of leadership is finding a way to deliver what clients need, not telling them what they can't have." And then he said the thing. The thing that still lives in the back of my head like a splinter. Frankly, Talia, I'm starting to wonder if this role has gotten too big for you. Maybe you were better suited to the technical work, the field work, the lab analysis. The project management side might be beyond your. He paused, choosing his words with the careful cruelty of a man who's practiced at making diminishment sound like concern. Beyond your current capacity. Beyond my current capacity. I had built his company's entire technical operation. I had written every quality control protocol. I had trained every scientist on his staff. I had delivered over $2 million in project revenue in the past year alone. And he was telling me the work was too big for me because I delivered a project 2 weeks late, a project he'd promised in an impossible timeline to make himself look good over a fly fishing trip. I sat in that chair, and I made a decision. Not an emotional decision, a strategic one. The kind of decision you make when you finally understand, with mathematical clarity, the difference between your value and your compensation. Keith, I said, I need some time to think about what you've said. Take the weekend, he said, magnanimous as a king granting a peasant an extra crust of bread. I didn't need the weekend. I needed a lawyer. I called my older brother that night, Weston Kendrick. He goes by West, an attorney in Helena who practices business law. I told him everything. The workload, the profit-sharing arrangement, the non-compete clause, the performance meeting. Wes listened carefully and then said 3 words that changed everything. Send me the contract. He called me back the next morning. Talia, this non-compete is unenforceable. Let me explain because this matters. In Montana, non-compete agreements are governed by statute. Montana Code Annotated Section 28-2-703 through 705, and the state takes a much narrower view of their enforceability than most. A non-compete has to be reasonable in scope, duration, and geographic area, and it has to protect a legitimate business interest, meaning trade secrets, proprietary methods, or specialized training the employer provided. What it can't do is simply prevent an employee from practicing their profession. My non-compete was 3 years, covered the entire state of Montana, and prohibited me from performing any environmental consulting services, which was, in West's words, the employment law equivalent of trying to ban a fish from swimming. I hadn't learned environmental science from Keith. I'd brought those skills to his company. My professional wetland scientist certification was mine, earned through my own education and experience. The technical methods I used were standard industry practices, not Bridger proprietary trade secrets. And 3 years across an entire state for a 12-person consulting firm? No Montana court would uphold that. You're free, Talia, West said. You've been free this whole time. You just didn't know it. I gave my 2 weeks' notice on a Wednesday. I wrote a professional resignation letter, 3 paragraphs, no emotion, effective in 14 days. I printed it, walked into Keith's office, and set it on his desk. He read it. Then he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not anger, not surprise, but something closer to alarm. The look of a man who has just felt the first tremor and is trying to decide if it's an earthquake. You're making a mistake, he said. Maybe. You think you can do this on your own? You think you can just... He waved his hand vaguely, encompassing the office, the filing cabinets, the view of the Clark Fork. There's nothing out there for you, Talia. The relationships are mine. The contracts are mine. The clients know me, not you. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. He believed what he believed, and in 2 weeks I'd be gone, and reality would do the arguing for me. On my last day, a Friday in August, I cleaned out my desk. It took 4 minutes. I hadn't accumulated much in 7 years. A few field guides, a mug from the Environmental Studies program, a photo of my dad and me on the Clark Fork that I kept tucked behind my monitor. Everything else in that office was work product, the reports, the templates, the training materials, the quality protocols, and those belonged to Bridger. Keith was leaning back in his chair when I dropped off my key card. That $1,200 chair. That corner office with the river view. You know what's out there, he said. Nothing. You'll be back in 6 months begging for your desk. I looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger. with something closer to the feeling I get when I'm standing in a watershed and I can see that the hydrology has shifted, that the water is going somewhere new, and there's nothing anyone can do to redirect it. "Goodbye, Keith," I said. And I walked out. Now here's where I need to tell you about the next 90 days. Because this is the part everyone wants to hear, the part where the clients follow and the empire rises and the boss gets his comeuppance. And it did happen, but not the way you think. Not cleanly, not easily, and not without cost. I started Kendrick Environmental on a Tuesday morning in September, working from the second bedroom of my apartment on South Higgins. I had savings, about $43,000, accumulated over 7 years of living frugally in a city where frugal living is practically the local religion. I filed my LLC with the Montana Secretary of State. I set up a business bank account at Glacier Bank on Broadway. I bought a $300 used desk from a guy on Craigslist in the Rattlesnake neighborhood who was moving to Boise. And then I did something that terrified me. I called my clients. Not Keith's clients. Mine. See, here's what Keith never understood, what his ego wouldn't let him understand. Over 7 years, the relationships had shifted. Yes, Keith had brought the clients in the door, but I was the one who'd walked their properties. I was the one who'd collected their soil samples and delineated their wetlands and written the reports that got their permits approved. I was the one who answered their calls at 7 a.m. and remembered the names of their kids and knew, from memory, the specific regulatory requirements for their specific project sites. When a client called Bridger Environmental with a technical question, they didn't ask for Keith. They asked for Talia. That had been true for at least 3 years, and Keith either didn't notice or didn't care because the check still came to his company. I didn't poach. I want to be very clear about that because it matters ethically and it matters legally. I did not call clients and say, "Leave Keith, come to me." What I did was send a simple, professional announcement, a one-page letter, mailed and emailed, informing the clients I'd personally worked with that I had left Bridger Environmental and started my own firm. That's it. No disparagement of Keith. No solicitation. Just, I've started a new firm. Here's my contact information. I wish Bridger Environmental continued success. Montana law is clear on this. Client relationships are not proprietary. An environmental scientist has every right to inform professional contacts of a career change. I wasn't stealing trade secrets or client lists. I was communicating my own professional status to people I'd personally served. The responses started coming within a week. The first call was from Garrett Wilder, the Whitefish Mountain Properties developer. The man whose $220,000 project I delivered in 14 weeks while Keith golfed and fished. "Talia," he said, "I was wondering when you'd make this call." "I'm not soliciting, Garrett. I just wanted you to know." "I know," he said. "When can you start on Phase 2? Phase 2 of the Whitefish development was another environmental assessment, a seasonal follow-up that Bridger was supposed to handle. Garrett was moving the contract to me, not because I'd asked, because he wanted the person who'd actually done the work. The second call came from a mining reclamation company in Butte, then a timber company in Kalispell, then a ranch developer in the Bitterroot Valley, then a county planning office in Flathead County that had worked with me on 3 separate projects and trusted my wetland delineations more than anyone else's in the state. Within 90 days, 11 of Bridger Environmental's top 20 clients had moved their active contracts or new project work to Kendrick Environmental. 11. More than half of the firm's premium client base, representing roughly $1.7 million in annual revenue. I didn't take them. They came. And the difference between those two things is the difference between this being a revenge story and this being a market correction. Let me tell you what was happening at Bridger during those 90 days because I wasn't watching it in real time. I was too busy doing actual work, but I heard about it later, piece by piece, from colleagues who stayed and from the industry grapevine that operates in Montana's consulting world with the speed and accuracy of a rural telephone party line. Keith panicked. He called clients personally, some for the first time in years, and tried to reassure them that Bridger could handle their projects without me. But the clients had questions. Technical questions. Questions about methodology and regulatory interpretation and permit timelines. Questions that Keith hadn't been able to answer himself in 5 years because he'd outsourced all technical knowledge to me. he hired a replacement. A junior environmental scientist from Bozeman named Drew, fresh out of Montana State's environmental engineering program, competent but green, no PWS certification, no Phase 1 ESA experience, no track record with any regulatory agency. Drew was being asked to step into the role that had taken me 7 years to build, and it wasn't fair to him. He was set up to fail, and I felt genuinely bad about that. 2 clients who'd stayed with Bridger came to me within 60 days after receiving work product that, I was told, didn't meet the standards they'd come to expect. One of them, a ranch developer named Pauline who ran a guest operation in the Blackfoot Valley, called me and said, with characteristic Montana bluntness, "Talia, I got a wetland delineation from your old firm that I wouldn't use to line a birdcage. Can you redo it?" I redid it, on my own time, at cost. Because Pauline was my client now, and earning trust is more important than earning money in the first 90 days of a new business. By December, 4 months after I'd walked out of Keith's office, Bridger Environmental had lost over half its revenue base. Keith laid off 3 employees, including Drew, who I later hired at Kendrick Environmental because he was talented and deserved a mentor who would actually mentor him. Keith's corner office, the one with the river view and the $1,200 chair, was surrendered when Bridger downsized to a smaller space on East Front Street. The river view was gone. The chair, I assume, went with him, though I honestly don't know and don't care. Now, and this is the part where I need to be honest about something uncomfortable, I didn't feel good about it. Not entirely. Not the way you'd expect. Was there satisfaction? Yes. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a moment. Driving past Bridger's old office and seeing the For Lease sign in the window, where something in my chest didn't unfurl like a fist slowly opening. After 7 years of being told that the company was Keith and Keith was the company, watching the market prove otherwise was vindicating in a way I don't have the vocabulary to fully describe. But there was also guilt. Real guilt. Because Keith Sattler wasn't an evil person. He was a limited one. He'd built something real. Bridger Environmental was a real company that did real work and employed real people, but he'd built it on a foundation of self-mythology that couldn't survive the departure of the person actually holding it up. And the employees who lost their jobs, the receptionist, the junior staff, the project coordinator, they didn't deserve to be casualties of Keith's inability to see what was right in front of him. I hired 2 of them. The project coordinator, a woman named Ines who'd been at Bridger for 4 years and was the most organized human being I've ever encountered, became my operations manager. Drew became my field scientist. They're both still with me. And then there's what happened with Keith himself. Because the story doesn't end with a For Lease sign and a downsized office. It ends with a voicemail. It was February, 6 months after I'd left, almost to the day. I was in the field, ankle-deep in a spring-fed creek near Seeley Lake, conducting a macroinvertebrate survey for a Forest Service restoration project. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my waders. I couldn't answer. My hands were full of sampling equipment and creek water, so it went to voicemail. I listened to it that evening, sitting in my truck in the parking lot of a gas station in Clearwater Junction, eating a bag of beef jerky from a cooler that also contained water samples. Missoula's environmental consulting industry at its most glamorous. Keith's voice. He sounded tired. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. The way a man sounds when the adrenaline of crisis has faded and what's left is the quiet arithmetic of loss. Talia. It's Keith. A pause. I owe you a conversation. Not an apology, I'm not. I don't think I'm there yet. But a conversation. About what happened. About what I missed. Another pause, longer. You were right about the staffing. You were right about the Whitefish timeline. You were probably right about a lot of things I didn't. He stopped. Started again. Anyway, if you're willing, you know the number. I sat in that truck for a long time after the voicemail ended. The sun was going down behind the Swan Range, painting the sky in those impossible Montana colors, deep pink fading to violet fading to that crystalline blue-black that you only get at altitude. And I thought about 7 years. About the creeks I'd waded and the reports I'd written, and the 14-hour days and the 11 pounds and the eye twitch, and the contract I never should have signed. And I thought about Keith, leaning back in his $1,200 chair, telling me there was nothing out there. Believing it. really, truly believing that the world outside his office was empty, because his office was the only world he could see. I called him back. Not that night, the next day, from my apartment after coffee, after I'd had time to decide what I wanted this conversation to be.
Keith. Talia.
A beat. Thanks for calling back. What do you want to talk about? Silence. The sound of a man who asked for a conversation and now has to have one. I think, he exhaled. I think I need to understand something. Those 11 clients. Did you plan it? Before you left, did you? No, I said. I sent an announcement letter. That's it. They called me. More silence. Then, all 11? All 11. I could hear him processing this. Rearranging the story he'd told himself. The one where I'd orchestrated a hostile takeover of his client base to accommodate a reality that was much simpler and much more painful. They chose to leave. I spent 7 years telling myself the company was me, he said finally. That the clients were mine. That the work happened because I made it happen. I know. And you never corrected me. This one stung. Because he was right. I hadn't corrected him. I'd let him believe the mythology because it was easier than the confrontation, because I was afraid of the non-compete, because I was grateful for the work, because I was 30 years old and tired and didn't know yet that silence in the face of someone taking credit for your labor isn't diplomacy. It's capitulation. No, I said. I didn't. That's on me. And on me, he said, for creating a situation where you couldn't. That was the most self-aware thing I'd ever heard Keith Sattler say. I don't know if it was enough. I don't know if a single sentence of insight can make up for years of institutional blindness. But it was something. It was a crack in the mythology. And sometimes a crack is where the light gets in, even if it takes a while for anything to grow. We talked for another 20 minutes. Not warmly, we're not friends, and I don't think we ever will be. But honestly, he asked about my firm. I told him. He asked how Drew was doing. I told him Drew was excellent and that Keith had never given him a fair chance. He didn't argue. At the end of the call, he said, "For what it's worth, you were the best environmental scientist I ever worked with. I should have told you that when it mattered." Yeah, I said. You should have. Today, Kendrick Environmental has 9 full-time employees and annual revenue of $2.4 million. We operate out of a real office now, a converted brick warehouse on West Alder Street in Missoula, with exposed beams and tall windows that let in the kind of natural light that makes reviewing field data feel slightly less like a punishment. We have a sample processing lab in the back. We have a conference room with a whiteboard that's never clean. Ines keeps the operations running with a precision that would make an air traffic controller nervous. Drew has his PWS certification now and is leading his own projects. I don't have a corner office. I have a desk in the main room, next to everyone else. On purpose. Bridger Environmental still exists.
Smaller.
Leaner. Keith brought in a technical partner, a hydrogeologist from Kalispell named Frank, who does the actual science that Keith can no longer credibly claim to do himself. They're surviving. Not thriving, but surviving. And in Montana's environmental consulting world, surviving counts. Keith and I don't talk regularly. We run into each other occasionally, at Montana Association of Registered Land Surveyors meetings, at DEQ stakeholder sessions, at the inevitable industry events where Missoula's small professional community crosses paths. He's civil. I'm civil. We're not performing friendship. We're practicing the kind of professional coexistence that adults do when history is complicated and the industry is too small for grudges. Last month, something happened that I haven't told anyone about yet. I was at a Montana Environmental Quality Council hearing in Helena, a public meeting about proposed changes to wetland mitigation banking regulations. I was there representing a client. Keith was there representing one of his. During a break, we were both standing at the coffee station in the hallway. He was stirring cream into a cup of terrible government building coffee, and he looked at me and said, almost casually, "Your comment during the public testimony was good. Really sharp analysis of the compensatory mitigation ratios." "Thanks," I said. "Your dad was a wildlife biologist, right? FWP."
Yeah.
"He taught you to read land, didn't he?" I always wondered where that came from. That thing you do where you walk a property once and know where all the water goes. I looked at him. He was being genuine. No performance, no angle. Just a man in a hallway, drinking bad coffee, admitting that the person he dismissed had a gift he'd never bothered to understand. Yeah, I said. He did. Keith nodded,
Sipped his coffee.
and walked back into the hearing room without another word. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't redemption. It was acknowledgement. And in its small, insufficient, deeply human way, it was enough. Some mornings, I get to my office early, before Ines, before Drew, before anyone, and I sit at my desk with a cup of coffee from Black Coffee roasting on North Higgins, and I look at the one personal item I keep on my desk, a small glass jar filled with creek stones from the Clark Fork. Smooth, gray, water-worn. I collected them during my senior thesis fieldwork 15 years ago, before Keith, before Bridger, before any of this. They're just rocks. They're not worth anything. But when I hold one, it's cold and smooth and it smells faintly of river water and iron, and it reminds me of the girl who stood knee-deep in a creek and fell in love with the science of paying attention. That girl didn't know she was building something. She was just turning over rocks and looking at what lived underneath. Turns out, that's all I've ever done. Keith told me there was nothing out there. He was wrong. There was everything out there. Every creek, every watershed, every parcel of land with a story written into its soil. He just couldn't see it from his corner office. You can't see a landscape through a window. You have to stand in it. I cleaned out my desk in 4 minutes. I built a company in 90 days. But the thing that made both of those possible, the expertise, the relationships, the stubborn insistence on doing the work correctly even when no one was watching, that took 7 years. And honestly, it took longer than that. It took a childhood in the Elkhorn Mountains with binoculars and a thermos. It took a basement lab that smelled like formaldehyde. It took a father who taught me to read land and a mother who taught me that patience is a form of power. My boss said I'd be back in 6 months begging for my desk. It's been 19 months. His desk isn't even in the same building anymore. Mine is in a brick warehouse on West Alder Street, and the morning light through the windows is extraordinary. I'm not going back. I was never going back. The creek only flows one direction. And the rocks at the bottom, the ones nobody sees, the ones that do the actual work of shaping the water and holding the ground, they were always the foundation. With or without the man who thought he was the river. If this story resonated with you, tell me about a boss who underestimated you, and what happened when you walked away. And if you're still sitting at that desk, wondering if there's something out there, there is. It's everything. Go find it.